every flyer's greatest fear. No, not a fellow passenger's crusty feet on your seat, but having the literal roof of the plane ripped off like you were sardines in a can. Our story begins in April of 1988. Tupac had just moved to California, the US was trafficking cocaine, and average monthly rent was only $420. Times were good, unless you were on Aloha Airlines Flight 243. You see, in Hawaii, commuting to work from island to island by air is quite prevalent, and Aloha Airlines was the undisputed top dog when it came to island hopping. However, their dominance was also their downfall. The plane at the center of this ordeal was a Boeing 737, and this specific individual aircraft had the highest usage among any 737 in the entire world at the time, clocking in at more than 90,000 flights before the incident. It even had already completed 3 round-trip flights from Honolulu to other islands earlier that day. As passengers were boarding the plane for its 4th flight of the day, the head flight attendant, Clarabelle Lansing, was completing her usual pre-check routine. The same routine that she had done thousands of times during her 37-year career with Aloha Airlines. Little did she know, this would be the final time she would ever do it. As Clarabelle Lansing was dutifully running through her checklist, one passenger noticed a crack in the body of the airplane as they were boarding. But she didn't say anything to the flight crew because she assumed they were already aware. As the expression goes, when you assume, you make an ass out of you and me. Or, in this case, send a crew member barreling out of the aircraft. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. The flight began without incident, and this observant passenger's lack of survival instincts caused no problems. But, as the flight hit 24,000 feet during its climb to a cruising altitude, disaster struck as the plane experienced explosive decompression. Because of that crack. To make matters worse, at the time of decompression, flight attendants were unsecured due to serving drinks. A total of 115 square feet of the plane's exterior detached and flew off into the sky, including chunks that entered the engines and smacked the wing and tail. The pressure differential between the previously sealed cabin and the tumultuous, frigid air also ripped much of the floor up, cargo was flung everywhere, and the cockpit door was ripped off its hinges. Did I mention that passengers were also pounded with hurricane force winds at temperatures of negative 30 degrees Fahrenheit? That's negative 34 degrees Celsius for our international audience. The head flight attendant, Clarabelle Lansing, met a particularly gruesome end during this violent decompression. Initially, she was sucked up into a small hole that formed during the first phase of decompression. As the pressure mounted and the plane continued to rip open, she was ejected completely, and the 58-year-old's body was never seen again. But it's an open question as to whether there even was a body left. The plane's fuselage was splattered with her blood. A distinct halo was formed where she was initially wedged, followed by a wide splatter over the next few windows. And the passenger directly beneath her in seat 6B was drenched in her blood. Miraculously, other flight attendant Jane Tomita was flung underneath a pile of debris after it struck her in the head, rendering her unconscious. The wreckage was kind enough to leave her in first class, too. The third and final flight attendant, Michelle Honda, clung to metal bars underneath the seat after she was knocked to the floor. After stabilizing herself, Michelle was not fucking around. She crawled from row to row by grasping the metal supports underneath each chair, while dodging swirling debris and helping passengers get outfitted with their life jackets. She also managed to reach the unconscious and bleeding flight attendant Jane, who was still trapped under debris. Amidst the chaos, oxygen masks were deployed, only to the dismay of passengers when they realized nothing was coming out of them. The delivery system was absolutely obliterated during the rapid decompression. As Michelle Honda tended to Jane, she realized debris had pierced and bloodied many passengers. But Michelle's is not the only account we have on record. Caught entirely by surprise, the pilots were almost launched from the aircraft as well. The cockpit floor fell 3 feet but held after snapping through the beams underneath it, barely hanging on by a thread. After regaining his composure, the pilot turned around and saw nothing but blue sky where the roof had been torn off. Have I mentioned that when the plane ripped open, the air in everyone's lungs was forcibly exhaled due to the pressure difference, and no one could breathe? The pilots were miraculously able to gain control of the aircraft and rapidly descend at a pace of up to 4,000 feet per minute. From the passengers' perspective, it looked like the cockpit was completely missing and they were in a nosedive going straight into the Pacific Ocean. At 10,000 feet, the pilots stabilized the plane and passengers were able to breathe freely as the pilots maydayed for an emergency landing. The plane's steering controls were damaged and not responding fluidly, plus the left engine had eventually ceased functioning. Against all odds, their landing gears deployed and they landed safely at the main airport on Maui. Although they were finally on the ground again, the injuries were severe. Almost every passenger had head trauma, lacerations, and windburns. Some had serious skull fractures, concussions, and puncture wounds. There were not enough ambulances to transport everyone to the hospital, so many people were taken in passenger vans of a local tourism business. Somehow, the only fatality from this whole incident was Clarabelle Lansing. As a multi-decade veteran of the airline that transported the same residents day in and day out, she was on a first-name basis with many of the passengers, which made the tragedy sting even more. So, what caused this violent mid-air accident? A huge investigation was launched to answer just that question. However, finding answers seemed like it would be very difficult, considering the evidence was floating somewhere out in the Pacific Ocean. However, the entire fuselage was so riddled with corrosion, cracks, and old repair patches that it wasn't hard to figure out what had happened, and it truly is a miracle that it managed to hold together long enough to even land. Secondly, this plane was one out of 291 produced by Boeing with a partially faulty bonding technique that made the fuselage more susceptible to corrosion, an issue particularly compounded by the salty, tropical environment that it operated in. Has anyone ever heard of Boeing screwing up the production of its planes? Third, the 737 model used by Aloha Airlines was only designed with a life cycle of 75,000 flights, a threshold that Flight 243's aircraft surpassed by a margin of 15,000 flights. Boeing might get a pass for this one, especially considering that negligence was found on the part of Aloha Airlines. 1 year before the incident, the Federal Aviation Administration issued new requirements for Boeing 737s with 40 to 50,000 flights logged due to the frequency of large cracks being found. One of these new requirements was something called an eddy current test, which is when an electrical current is run through some of the plane's metal joints, which enables a specialized machine to identify cracks not visible to the naked eye. But this was never performed by Aloha Airlines. Another mandate from the FAA required the replacement of certain original rivets with new fasteners, which, you guessed it, Aloha Airlines also never completed. Furthermore, there actually was a major failure by Boeing. They're getting on my bad side again. In their official manufacturer guidelines, they recommended detailed structural inspections every 20,000 flight hours. But flight hours are not the best metric when it comes to gauging wear and tear on the fuselage. Planes are pressurized before takeoff so everyone can breathe at high altitudes, and fatigue to the fuselage occurs mainly from cycles of cabin pressurization, not flight hours. The short flights from island to island in Hawaii created a situation where there were low flight hours relative to the amount of flight cycles. To make matters worse, it was not the first time that a Boeing 737 had experienced this exact same structural failure. 7 years prior in Taiwan, the same fuselage fastener failed, this time on the bottom of the aircraft as opposed to the top, which caused the plane to completely disband mid-air, killing everyone. To conclude this video, Aloha Airlines did not stand the test of time and folded in 2008. Its legacy is infamous from this tragedy, and all we are left with is this final image of Clarabelle Lansing and a garden at the airport in Maui named in her honor.